trusting God in the turbulence of life. This week the title is Trust God When Your Heart is Broken. If you ran across a person who had just experienced the death of a loved one, but you didn't know that they had just experienced the death of a loved one, you lift it up and push it.
Yeah, it was like maybe it was swollen a little bit.
If you didn't know the person had just suffered a death of a loved one, what signs would give it away? I mean, how would you recognize that this person was in grief?
Well, they were sad, I would think. Their face was sad. They were not responsive or talking very much.
Yeah, they might be very quiet.
No normal activities.
Pardon?
Missing normal activities.
Yes, not doing things they normally do, not being in places they normally would go.
They get able to focus.
Yep. Right?
Well, David's here.
Sorry, Dave's right there. Yep.
Hello.
Hello. Hi.
Hello there.
Morning.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
We were just trying to saying that if you came across a person who was experiencing the death of a loved one and was in grief, but you didn't know that they were in grief, what kind of visible signs would there be that would give you the idea that they were suffering in grief? And go ahead, what was the last one, Bruce?
Focus, being able to focus on.
Yeah, they're having a hard time concentrating or focusing on something. What else?
Tears.
Yes, could very well be sudden unexplained crying or tears. Withdrawing from people they normally would be associating with.
Maybe somebody who's normally outgoing is very quiet and introspective.
Right, right. So there are signs, because we all know that when a person is experiencing grief, it has a profound effect on the person, psychologically, mentally, spiritually, physically, and there are all kinds of things that happen to us when we're experiencing grief. Do you think that you could describe grief more as, instead of describing grief as a bad experience, could you describe it as a journey? And why would you say that?
Not having been on that road before.
And then you all of a sudden have to go
have
on
that
road.
loss or whatever.
Any other comment? Because grief is a terrible thing to have to endure and experience, but it's a lot more than just an incident that happens. It's a whole experience that changes us in a lot of ways.
It's also a long time, potentially a long time journey. It's not a short journey, it's a long journey.
It is, and in some cases, it never stops. In some cases, the person who is on this grief trip never gets over it entirely. And
It depends on how you regard that person that's gone, or how much you love that person. A lot of people that I know in my history would run to the bank, check the bank account.
Yeah, well, I don't know if I would call that a particularly
There's no grief there.
loving
well, that's not
relationship,
grief.
that's for sure.
That's grief.
And on top of all that, we know that Jesus experienced grief more than once.
Yeah.
Jesus was human, and he experienced everything that we as human beings experience. And we know, for example, at the death of his close friend, the
Lazarus.
scriptures tell us Jesus wept bitterly over the loss of a friend. So grief is something that is inescapable. It's something we all face, and sometimes often. So it brings us to our scripture reading for today, which comes from Matthew 5:4, And of course, in Matthew chapter 5, we find what is called the Sermon on the Mount. I think most of you understand that it's probably a collection of Jesus' most profound statements. That he probably didn't just stand on a hill somewhere and do this all in sequence. It's a combination of Jesus' teachings. But in Matthew chapter 5, verse 4, it says, and this has always bothered me, by the way, I didn't like this for a long time. Blessed are those who mourn. Why are you blessed in a situation where you're grieving? Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. In the Greek, the word mourn used here is a very, very strong and intense word. And it kind of means a passionate lament for a very dearly loved one who has died. It's the kind of agonizing grief that holds a person so completely you can't hide it. It just shows all over you. A deep sorrow that brings intense pain to the heart and tears to the eyes. The Beatitude seems to mean that a person is blessed if they are suffering through the bitterest sorrow life can bring. Now, how can that be true?
I think everybody goes through that. I mean, in their life, somewhere, sometime, you'll go through that. Most likely you'll go through that situation.
I agree. And I also would add to that comment that until you have been through that, you do not really understand what a person's going through that's going through it. It isn't until you've gone through it that you really have the empathy for someone who's experiencing that. James Moore provides us with this proverb. It's an Arab proverb, and I'll let you guys react to it. All sunshine makes a desert.
All sunshine
Yeah.
makes a desert.
That's right.
Yeah, yeah.
Tell me what that means.
Need some rain somewhere.
Ah.
Or some cloudy days, if nothing else.
Yeah, yeah. All sunshine makes a desert. Well, sunshine's great, but if that's all there is, everything burns to a crisp. You've got to have some clouds, you've got to have some rain in order for good things to grow, okay? A life in which there is nothing but sunshine becomes an arid life, whereas only rain and storms in life can bring the land to produce. So that must mean there are some beneficial experiences which only sorrow can beget. We go through grief, we go through sorrow. It's a horrible thing to experience, but there are some benefits to be derived from doing it. And James says there's actually two big things that sorrow can actually do for us. Number one, it can show us in a way nothing else can the kindness and the love of your fellow man. And two, it can show you as nothing else can the comfort and compassion of God. You know, when things are going well and you're just sailing along all happy-go-lucky and everything's going fine, you can go on for years very much living on the surface of things, sort of. You know, you're just skipping along. But when sorrow comes, when you reach that point, you're really driven into the deeper things in life. And from it can come some things that provide you with a lot of strength. There's a poem here that says the author is unknown. I walked a mile with pleasure, she chattered all the way, but left me none the wiser for all she had to say. I walked a mile with sorrow, and ne'er a word, said she. Oh, the things I learned from her when sorrow walked with me.
I think sorrow makes you appreciate your life a lot. I mean, and understand, you know, you don't know when you're going to have this, and days are numbered, and you need to, you know, but I think sorrow makes you a more compassionate person also.
And I think that not just sorrow, but I think there are a lot of things in life. If you haven't got anything to compare anything with, nothing means anything. You know, if your entire life was just full of roses and all hunky-dory, you wouldn't have an appreciation for anything, really.
You get tired of roses.
Yeah, you would. You would get tired of roses. And you have, it's the uncomfortable things, the sorrowful things, the bad things that happen to us in life that really make us appreciate the good things. You know, that's just the way things seem to work.
I presume you covered the very beginning, which is as far as I've gotten in here, on life's a journey. And
yes.
appreciate the journey.
Yes. Well, no, haven't got there yet.
Oh.
Yet.
All right, sorry. That was the very first chapter, beginning of it, so.
Oh,
Didn't
you
cover
mean,
this last
you mean
week?
on the first chapter?
Yes,
Yeah, we did all that a week ago.
I understand, we missed it.
Yes,
So,
you did.
But I did get a chance to read it,
Oh,
so.
good, good. See, he gets the book I use on, and then he's reading the book, and I gotta be really careful because he can correct me real quick if
No,
I
it was
miss
just to
something.
keep up, because we missed too much.
So James Moore makes this comment. He says, be sure of one thing. When Jesus said, blessed are those who mourn, he did not mean that we should languish in a pool of self-pity. He certainly did not intend for us to become fixated on our grief.
It's hard not to do.
Yeah, sure, you're not kidding. He says, example here, there's a woman who lost her only son in Vietnam. You can imagine the devastation. When news came, she pulled down all the shades in her home, closed all the windows up. 20 years later, those shades are all still down. And she only slips out at night under cover of darkness to buy groceries. Otherwise stays secluded and locked up in her home. James Moore says Jesus would find that very sad. Very sad, because a broken heart can be the start of something very powerful and very wonderful. This woman never got past a point where she should have gotten past.
And there's a word that you haven't touched on yet, but blessed are those who mourn. What does blessing mean? Blessed. What does that what is he really saying there? Blessed is the key to that, answering that
Right,
question
well,
to me, anyway.
What do you say?
I'm not sure. I'm really not sure, but I know that you can't digest the entire phrase without thinking about what that
Right.
means.
Right.
I'm not sure either, but I think it suggests that you do have some relief, whether you recognize it or not.
Well, it also said, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. That's saying that Jesus is telling us that we will be comforted, and that's important.
And what does blessed do for you? What is the value of
In my
blessedness?
opinion, it's the good that comes out of something,
Okay.
okay?
So it's not anything that God does for you, it's inside yourself.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the blessing that comes from grieving is something that you work through and end up with as a positive from your experience.
Okay, so it's a gift.
Yeah,
Okay.
I would
And
say so.
the part about mourning, from the Greek, meaning, I'm inferring it's more public. If I hide my grief, I'm not gonna get blessed for it,
You're not kidding.
because there's nobody
If you
around.
hide your grief and
to-
keep it bottled up inside, you're gonna be cursed.
If I bring it out, there will be people that respond and bless me in
There
their
you are.
way
There you are.
for what I shared.
I like that. I'm gonna take the time here to read a story that James Moore tells. I found it kind of fascinating when I read it. He said he recently went to a college football game with some friends of his, and he said during the course of the evening, he thumbed through the football program. And he said he was fascinated by how sophisticated they'd become. What once consisted of not much more than the team rosters and a few ads had now become a full-scale magazine. Intrigued by this, I skimmed through the program, he says, making mental notes of its contents. Of course, the team rosters were listed. There were pictures of the players with some biographical and statistical information. In addition, there were pictures of the coaches and the cheerleaders and the bands. There were schedules, full-page, colorful ads, a president's page, and some well-written and interesting sports articles. For example, in this particular program, he says there was an article entitled, "How to Play Strong Safety," and one on Doc Blanchard and Glenn Davis, two of the most celebrated college players of all time, played for Army at West Point. Still another article was called "How Some of the Famous Teams Got Their Famous Nicknames," and another was on women in sports. He says as he continued to peruse, he did a double take. Smack dab in the middle of this college football program was an article entitled, of all things, "Death and How to Deal with It." It was an article on grief. And his first response was, "Good grief. What is this doing in a football program?" He says he read on, it became clear it was a description of a new course being taught at the university. The course was trying to help students to be better prepared to understand and deal with the grieving process. The article showed that grief, not depression, over the loss of a loved one is both desirable and appropriate. And such an expression of emotion is to be encouraged. But American culture teaches to the contrary. Stoic strength during bereavement is considered virtuous. In the article, students were encouraged to recall deaths of loved ones and of pets, as well as experiences of separation or divorce. The article pointed out that the grieving process is a paradox. It brings sorrow, but it can also become a moment of great growth. Growing experiences like this are not always pleasant, but the comfort factor lies in the possibility that in the moment of crisis, families may be brought closer together. People get close to the reality of their own death, and these experiences tend to reaffirm their commitments to life plans, and spiritual beliefs. He said this whole thing reminded him of a comment made by one of his seminary professors, Dr. Robert Browning. He said, "Never preach a sermon without a word of comfort in it, because there will always be someone in hearing distance who is grieving. There will always be somebody in the congregation with a broken heart." Well, grief is a fact of life. We all know that. We all face it from time to time. But often people do not know how to deal with it. I mean, how do you heal a broken heart? How do you get through a period of grief? What exactly does grief do to us? And how can our faith help us with this? He gives this little illustration from comics, Peanuts. Charlie Brown is pitching in a baseball game. It's not going well. In fact, it couldn't be any worse. He's getting pounded by the other team's hitters. So his teammates gather around him on the pitcher's mound as he laments about how terribly things are going and wonders aloud why he has to suffer so much. His friends begin discussing the problem of suffering in the world with all kinds of cliches and platitudes. And as they talk on and on and on, Charlie Brown steps away from them and he comments to the reader, "I don't have a ball team, I have a theological seminary." And what this is saying to us is how we tend to dabble around the edges of the grief process. We are often willing to accept superficial, unsatisfactory, and unproductive answers to how to deal with it. And when we do that, we end up getting stuck with those unsatisfactory answers permanently. So, exactly what is grief? Now, we all know what it feels like. But exactly what is it? I mean, it is primarily the painful experience of loss. We feel it every time we lose something that is special to us. intense feeling of separation. And it doesn't have to be a person. It can be a thing. It can be a marriage. It can be a pet. It can even be a place that we really love very much and that we know we'll never be able to see or experience again. It can be defined as sorrow, as disappointment, as loneliness or heartache. And it's not only limited, as I say, to death. But when Jesus says that there is a blessedness in mourning, it's a kind of a way of saying that grief is a journey. Grief has a starting point and it has a destination. It's something we have to walk through. It's a pilgrimage. Even Jesus spoke of the strength that comes from going through the process of mourning. Now, as Scott mentioned, it takes time to make this pilgrimage, and for some people it takes a lot longer than others. There are certain stages that we have to pass through along the way, and it's a big mistake if we stop at any one of those stages. It's damaging and destructive, any one of those places, if we don't get through it. If we stay too long in one spot. And he contends that this journey can actually be made a lot easier if we are consciously able to recognize these different stages as we pass through them. That we actually know which stage we are in at a given time really helps us to continue the journey. Now, this is something I'll bet that everybody in here has heard before. But we're going to go through it again, keeping in mind how our faith might be able to help us at each stage of the way. There are basically 6 stages of grief. The first one is shock, numb. And it's a really strange thing because it combines shock with strength. What it does, that shock, it actually anesthetizes us. You know, it's like being given some kind of anesthesia. It's something that's meant to help us get through those first terrible hours. But as the first few hours and days go by, you know, then we begin to get more and more pain. The anesthesia begins to wear off. The shock is passing by. So that brings us to a second stage, which is the period of emotionalism. And this is when we have those deep pains down inside of us. And these painful feelings absolutely have to be ventilated. The longer they are held within, the longer you hold that pain inside, the more miserable you are and the more damage it does. It is at this stage that most of us fail miserably. First of all, we try to deny the reality of the loss. I can't believe this has happened. I can't, you know, if somebody calls and says, you know, so-and-so just died. I can't believe, no, there's no way. I just saw him 2-3 days ago. I can't believe it. And there's this denial thing that takes place to begin with. And when we do that, we also are denying the reality of the grief itself. See? And we do this in a number of ways. Some people are very stoic. Some people intentionally try to be real tough about it, hide their emotions. Some people try to show how strong they are. I think, personally, this is a bigger problem with men a lot of the times than it is with women. Especially if you're the head of the family. I mean, you're expected to be strong for everybody else. You know, be the rock on which everybody else can crumble and cry. But truth of the matter is that breaking down and crying is perfectly okay, even if you happen to be a macho guy. It is not a sign of weakness. It does not mean you are selfish. He gives an example. If you smack your thumb with a hammer and tears come to your eyes, after you've spoken a few expletives maybe, nobody's going to tell you that you're weak and selfish. I mean, it hurts, right? And it's painful, so you cry. Well, that's no different than grief. You've been wounded. and that creates profound emotions. And in this stage, you have to talk it out, you have to cry it out, you have to work it out, you have to pray it out in order to get through that stage of emotionalism and on to the next stage.
You know, excuse me for interrupting, but everything you say is right, but what I think is that when somebody loses something, like a loved one, or it could be a pet, it could be anything, there's an assumption that whatever they lost belonged to them in the first place, and nothing belongs to us. Absolutely nothing.
Yeah,
And we're going to lose our life, and it doesn't belong to us.
right.
And so, what people, the severity of the grief is the belief that that belonged to you, and it should never have been taken away.
Right.
And that's what you got to struggle with, is realize, wow, you know, that really, I mean, I ought to spend time enjoying what happened with that person, all the joy that we had, and let it go. It never belonged to me in the first place.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's absolutely true.
And I don't think we get to that, to what Bruce said, unless, again, we make the grief public. That's one of the parts of the blessing. You get reminded.
That's
That
correct.
son I love because he's my only son wasn't mine.
Right.
The love he gave me, the love I gave him, could have been mine.
Well, once you get past this emotional stage, which is critically important, because like I said, if you stay in any one of these stages too long, you really can get damaged. The third stage becomes a stage of loneliness. You begin to feel as if you're all by yourself. You begin to feel isolated. And this is especially true if it's a relationship that's lasted a long period of time. A couple that's been married for 65 or 70 years. You know, the one suddenly dies, the surviving spouse is lost. I mean, they feel like they're all alone in the world. They feel like half of themselves has been taken away, and there's just nobody. You've lost a very unique, long-time relationship. And, you know, this is something James Moore says that I entirely agree with. Nobody in the world can feel your specific loss the way you do. Nobody. It's your loss. Nobody can understand it and feel it the way you feel it. It's a valley you have to walk through alone, with the exception that only God does understand. God is there to walk the valley with you. Well, then fourth, oddly enough, comes a stage of resentment and anger. It's a time where you start asking a lot of really angry questions. Why did this happen to me? Whose fault was this? Where was God when this happened? Why did God permit this to take place? And in a large percentage of the time, the anger is directed exactly against God. Even though God hasn't had anything to do with it, isn't responsible for it at all, God becomes the target. And we get angry with God. Why'd you let this happen to me? Once you can get past the anger, you come to the fifth stage.
Well, I think it's more resentment, excuse me, but especially if the typical thing, a wonderful person dies that you love, and some crummy human being you know is not worth anything. And I think you resent, why did this happen to this person and this person's still wandering around? And I think that's a lot of times the real resentment in the whole thing.
Well,
You know,
know,
when good
like I
things
said a week ago at church, you know, why do bad things happen to good people? Well, for the
exactly.
same reason that
Yeah.
good things happen to bad people. It happens. You know?
I know, but
It doesn't do any good to get mad about it. It's just the way it is. But people have a tendency to really blame God for bad things that happen.
Mm-hmm.
Fifth, there's the stage, after you get past the anger, you come to the stage of guilt. The worst of it, we wish we could have just one last chance to say some things or do some things that we never really got around to doing when we should have? Why didn't I spend more time with him? Why didn't I call more often? Why didn't I tell her I loved her? And you go through this whole guilt thing. You know, you're trying to take this journey, you keep trying to purge yourself of all these things that are happening. But then hopefully, and finally, we come to the very last stage, and that is reality. And if you get to this stage, James Moore says it is a victory. It is a victory because it means you're ready to get on with your life. You're ready to go on living, go on working, getting on with things. It's important, he says, to understand one thing here. Being able to go on with your life is the greatest tribute you can pay to the one who's been lost. And it is the greatest tribute you can pay to God as well. Well, 3 ways that our faith can really help us with this whole process. And he says, first, seek the healing fellowship of the church. You know, I've known a couple of times people who were very regular, very loyal church members. Saw them every Sunday. And then one of them died, and the other one never came back to church. And the person is questioned, say, you know, we really missed you. Why haven't you been in church? And their response is, I just can't do it. It's too emotional. I spent so many years sitting next to my husband in church, I can't do it. I can't deal with it. James Moore says, that's the worst thing you can do. It's the worst thing you can do. The best thing you can do is to come back as fast as you possibly can into the healing fellowship of the church. He says, let your church family hug you. Let your church family surround you with love, prayers, handshakes, memories, words of comfort and strength, and casseroles.
Yeah, you got that right.
Food is good for the soul.
Yes. You just get back to the church just as soon as you can and let the church be part of the healing process. This is the second thing. Be ready to serve with the new power you have now acquired. What power is that?
Well, one is the power of understanding to help other people.
Right.
Help other people that have been through what you've gone through.
You now understand.
You understand what they're going through.
Younger people who have never experienced the death of a close loved one. I mean, they sympathize with people who are grieving, but they're not empathizing. They feel sorry for you. They say it must be terrible. First time I heard of a parent who lost a young child. That must be terrible. But there's no way I could understand or appreciate or empathize what that really meant until you've been through it. I haven't been through the loss of a child, but I mean, you have to go through this. Once you have been through it, you have a new power. You have the power to help other people get through their grief. You are now better equipped because of your own pilgrimage through grief that you can now help somebody else get through it. You have a new empathy, a new compassion, a new strength, a new power to help others. Well, I tell you what, I've had to do a couple things in recent years that I could never have done before. And it reminds me of Faith.
Faith in Dennis.
Some of you knew Faith and Dennis Rodriguez, and some of you don't.
Yeah.
They were members that are active in our church. He was 54. He was 54 years old, and he was in a motorcycle accident. And got skinned up pretty bad, couple broken ribs. And he was in the hospital, and they said, you're gonna be fine, and that night he died. Blood clot. Killed him. And I got a phone call about 2 o'clock in the morning from Faith, and she was weeping and said, can you come, can you come? At 2 o'clock in the morning, she was over at Sunrise Hospital. So, I ran upstairs, grabbed my support system, and we headed over to Sunrise Hospital, and she was sitting there next to his body. Just, oh God, just sobbing, just shaking and sobbing. And I thought, I can't do this. So, but we did, we sat there, I stood there next to her with my arm around her for about 2 hours, waiting for the coroner to show up. And prayed with her a little bit. And I tell you, I couldn't have done that a few years back. But, you know, I could appreciate what was happening with her, and so I knew better how I could deal with that. And I came to discover in my life that in situations like that, you really don't have to say anything. Not really. All you have to do is be there. And let the person know you care and you love. And that's usually good enough. You don't have to be some genius to come up with the right things to say. Because the chances are there's no right things to say anyway.
Right.
Third, he says, in addition to rejoining the life of the church as soon as possible, and in addition to being willing to serve by using your new strength, the third thing is to claim the constant presence of God, who is with us at all times. And he gives us this poignant little story as a way of ending this lesson. A young man whose wife had died left him with their small son. When they arrived home from the cemetery, they went to bed early because there was nothing else they could bear to do. As the young man lay there in the darkness, grief-stricken, heartbroken, numb with sorrow, the little boy broke the stillness from his little bed with a disturbing question. Daddy, where is Mommy? The father tried to get the little boy to go to sleep. Questions kept coming from his confused, childish mind. Where's Mommy? Why isn't she here? When is she coming back? After a while, the father got up and brought the little boy to bed with him. But the child was still disturbed and restless and would occasionally ask a probing, painful question. Finally, the little boy reached out his hand through the darkness and placed it on his father's face. Then he asked, Daddy, is your face toward me? Given assurance, both verbally and by his own touch, that his father's face was indeed toward him, the little boy said, Daddy, if your face is toward me, I think I can go to sleep now. And in a little while he was quiet. The father then lay there in the darkness, and in childlike faith, he lifted up his own needy heart to his Father in heaven and prayed, O God, the way is dark, and I confess that right now I do not see my way through. But if your face is toward me, somehow I think I can make it. If you're experiencing grief, rely on the church. Use your experience to help others and look for God's face. Okay, that's it.
That was very good.
That was very
I'm glad I
good.
could end on
Here's your
a word of joy and happiness.